Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. We were just taking a few minutes as people joined, but I think we can go ahead and get started. Thank you, everyone, for joining. This is the second event in this year's Rising Up for Human Dignity series. And this year's series focuses on the nature of justice and repair, centering on the different forms justice can take and the nature of reparations and repair, examining the needs and the practice through diverse communities. Our sponsoring organizations include Oregon Jewish Museum and Center for Holocaust Education, Never Again Coalition, PSU's Holocaust and Genocide Studies Project, World Oregon, Oregon Historical Society, and Kol Shalom's Community for Humanistic Judaism. And I'm Lauren Forking, Director of the Never Again Coalition. Today's discussion, Confronting the Empire of Silence, Community-Led Justice in the DRC, will focus on the culture of impunity communities in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo are facing, and how they are forging their own paths forward to create and support sustainable solutions to end the protracted crisis and find justice. Before we get started, I wanted to make a technology acknowledgement. This year, the Rising Up for Human Dignity series is a completely online series. With that in mind, we would like to acknowledge that our organizers, panelists, and audience members are able to participate in this programming by using devices that contain in their essential components tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold, also known as conflict minerals. Fueled by consumer demand, corporate greed, government policies, and inaction by the international community, the extraction from the earth and sale of conflict minerals has motivated and perpetuated armed conflict and contributed to societal instability, rape, and other forms of extreme violence, particularly in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are grateful for the means of connection and communication that rely on these precious resources. And because of that, we affirm our commitment to use them to advocate for justice, accountability, and restoration of peace and stability in the lands of their origin. I think that we'll probably hear a lot more about these connections from our panelists in a moment. Our panelists today are part of the Ponzi Foundation. They'll be able to tell you a lot more about the foundation in a few moments, but by way of introduction, Ponzi is a non-governmental organization that provides survivors of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo with access to compassionate, holistic care. Our panelists today are Natalie Colombo. Born in Kinshasa, DRC, and raised in Houston, Texas, Natalie is the Transitional Justice Fellow at Ponzi US. A licensed attorney and practicing litigator, she received her LLM at Emory University School of Law, specializing in international human rights law and transitional justice. To this end, she has worked with the Carter Center and the U.S. State Department on DRC and transitional justice-related projects. Namweze Badomeke is a gender and responsible sourcing specialist at Ponzi Foundation. Prior to that, she set up Ponzi's first jewelry workshop as part of the ethical and inclusive value chain model that the organization has been developing. She was also Ponzi's focal point for the National Network of Survivors of Sexual Violence in DRC. Namweze did her master's in African Studies at Oxford University and has a bachelor's of science in international business management from the University of Applied Sciences in Geneva. And last but not least, facilitating our panel today is Emily Warren. She's the executive director of the U.S. Office of Ponzi Hospital and Foundation, where she has worked for more than 5 years. Emily has over a decade of experience in nonprofit development, marketing, and operations with a focus on global health, maternal health, and education. She's worked with organizations based in the Middle East, North Africa, and East Africa, as well as domestically in the United States. And I'd like to just turn it over to you to just kind of introduce the subject, Emily, if that's okay.
Yes, thank you so much, Lauren. We're very grateful to be a part of this panel discussion today, following those who are able to watch the Empire of Silence documentary. I apologize that my colleagues, Natalie and Namweze, have not yet joined. I believe they are both trying. We're experiencing a few technical difficulties, but I know Natalie should be joining us shortly in particular. By way of introduction, Lauren, that was an excellent overview of what Ponzi does. As just to expand a little bit further on our work and the intersection between justice for DRC and our direct implementation of activities. As Lauren said, Ponzi Hospital and Ponzi Foundation is a center of excellence for the holistic treatment of survivors of sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, founded by 2018 Nobel Peace Prize laureate Dr. Denis Mukwege. We utilize a 4-pillar holistic healing model that includes access to medical care, psychosocial support, socioeconomic reintegration activities, and then access to legal services. And all of that is underscored by our advocacy efforts to advance peace and justice in the DRC. For those who were able to watch the documentary, you understand the culture of impunity that exists, and that one of the reasons why mass atrocities, including sexual violence, continue to be perpetrated 25 plus years after the genesis of the conflict. It is because no one is held accountable for their crimes, and also largely because of a lack of political will by the international community to act. So one of the things that we are advocating for quite strongly, and what is a key component of our model and our work, is ensuring peace and justice in the DRC through judicial and non-judicial mechanisms of transitional justice. And I see that Natalie, our advocacy fellow, has just joined us, and so that she can give herself a little bit of an introduction of her role, and then we are happy to answer any questions and discuss the different strategies that civil society organizations like Ponzi are enacting in order to further peace efforts in the country. Thank you very much, Natalie, for joining us, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for having us today, and thank you for having me and allowing me to be part of this conversation. As Emily introduced, I am part of the Pansy Foundation U.S. office, and I work as the advocacy fellow here. And my role is to effectively help us sort of design our transitional justice strategy, and sort of bring proposals on what is effective at whatever particular juncture we're in as an organization. And I work fully as an attorney. Full-time, I represent survivors of sexual and domestic violence in a family context. And when I'm not doing that, I'm working on transitional justice with the Pansy Foundation. Prior to this, I've had an opportunity to work with the State Department on transitional justice, as well as with the Carter Center in designing transitional justice mechanisms specifically for constitution redrafting within societies that are seeking to transition from segments of turmoil into peace, where there is ethnic diversity, so much so that it causes friction within society. So that is some of the experience that I've had in the context of transitional justice. And here with Pansy, really, a lot of our work has been focused on figuring out which of the transitional justice mechanisms make the most sense for us to tackle as an organization. And with that, what strategies make the most sense in line with the research that we've been conducting to figure out what is most effective, what has been done in the past. How do we build a coalition that allows us to effectively have transitional justice in the DRC? Some of you may know or not know, transitional justice is a very political process. Sometimes I think when we discuss it, we talk about it in a very abstract way that makes it seem that it can sort of exist on its own without the participation of political actors, unfortunately, or fortunately, because fortunately in the sense that if there are political actors involved, then there's a sense of permanence to the objectives and the mechanisms that we're able to implement. And unfortunately, in the sense of if there's no assent to the process, and it makes it exceedingly difficult to do. And so we've certainly experienced that on the ground, and we're working to think of creative and strategic ways in which we can make transitional justice a successful operation in the DRC.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Natalie, for that introduction. That was incredibly helpful. I think that my role is to facilitate some of the questions that we might be receiving from our audience members, and some of which I know we might have collected in advance. So if you have any questions or things that you would like us to discuss, please do share them with Lauren and Amber, our two moderators, or with myself directly, if that is easier. I believe the first question that we have, it alludes to, Natalie, what you just discussed regarding how transitional justice can take many forms. The question says, it's my understanding that the DRC government has not formally initiated any proceedings or initiatives to pursue justice for crimes of the past. How do organizations like your own respond when faced with inaction by their own government? Natalie, do you have a response to that question? I think you might be muted, but it looked like your answer was starting off quite strong.
Thank you. We can answer that in two ways. There's the abstract general transitional justice way, and then there is as applied to the DRC, and particularly as applied to Pansy and what we are doing as an organization to address that. So I think, just generally speaking, it's important to understand transitional justice mechanisms, right? So transitional justice is seeking to look at complex issues where there is a widespread abuse of human rights, and seeking to implement certain mechanisms in order to transition a particular nation from that strife to peace, and where there is lasting peace. And so with that, to that end, there are several mechanisms that are not exhaustive, but certainly formulate the central pieces of transitional justice. And so when we're talking about a government that is not amenable to transitional justice, irrespective of what it is, it could be a certain mechanism or it could be transitional justice at large, then we look to what are the mechanisms that we have available to us, what are the transitional justice mechanisms, and which one of them can we sort of attempt to execute that would help us in persuading the government to participate in transitional justice. So we can go the persuasive route, or we can even go in the route of creating such a friction in which we force the government, for lack of a better term, to want to participate in transitional justice. So some of those mechanisms, for example, are truth and reconciliation commissions. Another one of those is vetting. So we are vetting the institutions to try to ascertain what part of the infrastructure that exists in a nation that allows it to continue to sort of promulgate some of these high-level human rights offenses and abuses. And just to go back a little bit to truth and reconciliation commissions, we've seen them, right? We've seen them in South Africa. We've seen them even with Nuremberg post World War II. Basically, it's a congregation of and a conversation with victims and survivors and perpetrators who are given an opportunity to sort of talk about what exactly the harm was, who were the particular actors, what the victims endured, and have that be written down and discussed, and usually in a very public setting, so where the entire country has an opportunity to hear some of the narratives and the truth, right, behind some of those abuses. And what that does, it creates a uniformed narrative about who the perpetrators were and who the victims were, which is fundamentally necessary if you're going to tackle transitional justice in an equitable, which is necessary, way. And when we are assessing sort of how we apply pressure on governments to be able to agree to transitional justice, we have found, we have seen it in Argentina, we've seen it in Colombia, where truth and justice reconciliations end up actually being a very effective way to force the government to participate in transitional justice. And the reason for that is because once the truth is being told, once the depths of the violations of human rights abuses are being told to the general public and to the victims and the entire nation effectively, as well as ousting the perpetrators. There is this righteous indignation that stirs up in society and the population, and they then begin to demand answers. And if it's widespread enough, then there is sufficient pressure applied to the government that forces them to then act. So then we see that used as that mechanism used as an avenue to allow us to begin to then pursue other mechanisms like prosecutions, for example, which tend to be a much more difficult mechanism to have nations agree to before pressure is applied. So those, I would say that's sort of the general response, is looking to the mechanisms and seeing what is most effective. And then attempting to apply pressure as it pertains to Pansy in particular. We have been certainly engaging in research that is giving us an idea of, when transitional justice has been supported. And also, let's say the pressure should not just be from internally, right, from the nation, particularly in nations like the DRC, where we find very weak governance. We know that in order to facilitate transitional justice, which requires a lot of money, a lot of the times, particularly if you're talking about prosecutions and putting together, expansive truth and reconciliation commissions, it requires a lot of money. And so if we find a weak governance and we find insufficient funds to promote transitional justice and insufficient pressure on the local government, then we need to sort of outsource that and create a situation where we have partners, international partners, who are also pressurizing that particular government to participate in transitional justice. So we're looking at conducting research to see what has been the pattern of nations who've large sort of Western nations who've decided to partner with transitional justice in a developing nation. What were sort of some of the influencing factors that forced their hand to participate in transitional justice or to support transitional justice in developing nations? So that's a lot of what we've been doing thus far, is sort of laying the groundwork and ascertaining what would be our most effective strategy as a result of what has happened in the past, as we look at various nations who've been successful at pressurizing their own governments to undertake transitional justice.
Thank you, Natalie. Very much in line with talking about our strategies. We have a question asking us if we can share a specific example of a transitional justice initiative that Pansy is a part of, or one that you were hoping to do. And in particular, I think through, if you wanted to speak to the partnership that we are developing with the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, which we are hoping to action later this year, if you would perhaps want to speak on that, or other initiatives that we do with civil society. And I'm also happy to speak to any of those as well, Natalie, if you need a water break. So
yeah, no worries. Thank you. As Emily mentioned, we have a project proposal with the Abari Foundation, or the Abari, to sort of begin to pursue some of these avenues that I just previously discussed, one of which being an international conference was part of our proposal in that. And we hope that it functions in two folds. One, as an international conference that sort of brings together various players and actors to apply pressure, Western players to apply pressure on the DRC, and also to serve as a truth and reconciliation commission in and of itself. So the proposal envisions bringing survivors and victims to tell their stories. And it also envisions training up people in on the ground in the DRC, in particular communities that have been brutalized, training them to understand how to appropriately interview survivors to get their stories and their survival stories, so that we can begin to create that unified narrative about what has happened, and in so doing present that at an international conference where we invite various nations and actors and political actors and media to tell the story of what is happening in the DRC. And in so doing, we'll sort of sound the alarm and hopefully create that trajectory of applying pressure on the DRC government. So I could go in a lot more detail about what the project proposal entails, but that's sort of the abstract proposal that we have. And so we're still in the portion of the phases where we're looking for funding and seeking to execute that. But in terms of, the idea of the international conference and training up interviewers to gain the stories of survivors and victims and all of that stuff, that's pretty squared away. And so that's sort of one of the project proposals that we're working on right now. I know that we've also been working with some of our colleagues on the ground in the DRC to excavate some locations of mass graves and mass burials to, again, create that narrative, create that story that we're able to present to the Congolese population and foreign actors and say, look at the evidence that we have, and this is the reason why we need to be able to, or we need to support prosecutions and not support impunity in the DRC as an avenue of how we force transitional justice. So that's two of the projects that I can think of off of the top of my head that we've been working on as of late. But Emily, feel free to insert more if you have any.
No, thank you, Natalie. And I think that this goes well into the next question that we've received. One thing that I'd want to underscore, in particular with the initiative that we are hoping to enact with the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute, is actually involving survivors within the peace process itself. And ensuring that they not only can play an active role based on their experience, but that this is an opportunity for them and their sort of lived experience to add to justice as something that they've requested themselves, something that they're interested in doing. So actually providing survivors of sexual violence and these mass atrocities with the correct training to be collecting testimonies and evidence themselves, which could then be used in judicial courts or mechanisms for transitional justice. So the next question that we had received says, it seems that a Truth and Reconciliation Commission won't work in DRC because the population already knows the extent of the atrocities and the government will not allow unfettered investigation. How can the international community change the cycle of violence that the movie so clearly depicted, especially as their own silence is complicit in the cycle of violence? And so I'll turn this to Natalie in one second, but just drawing sort of the line between, or the correlation between the two. The person who asked this question is absolutely right, that the community, or many of these communities, are aware of some of these atrocities that have occurred. What there is outrage and indignation within these communities for is that they have not been recognized by the international community. And one of the things that Natalie mentioned is identifying these mass grave sites. We have, and I'm sorry that some of them aren't able to be here because of the time difference in Bukavu, but we have teams from our civil society advocacy organizations who actually go out into very remote communities where either mass rapes or mass murders have taken place. And they work with survivors of those atrocities to identify the locations of where a mass grave might be, but where the only marker has been actually recognition has been made by that community themselves. And there has been no national or international recognition of that happened. And that, I think, is where sort of, yes, a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, understanding that there's outrage within the community, but then how can that be used in a formalized way to then generate some of that political will and some of that international outrage that could potentially move the needle to push the national government in DRC to actually make some progress themselves, or then push members of the international community, whether it's the United States, whether it's members of European nations, et cetera, to then in turn place pressure on the DRC government to to be able to start to enact or make some of these changes or request an internationalized component, some kind of international involvement to the various mechanisms that exist to prosecute these crimes. So Natalie, if you need me to re-answer that question, because I went off on a little soliloquy of my own, please let me know. Otherwise, I'm happy to turn it to you regarding how the international community can change this cycle of violence in particular.
Yeah. No, I think you did a great job with that answer. And the only thing I think that I would add is there's with respect to transitional justice, there is knowledge, as in like general knowledge of the fact that like we are survivors, right? So if you think about it in that context, I don't think South Africa needed to have a TRC concerning the fact that there was like apartheid taking place, right? Like the entire country was quite aware of that, or in Sri Lanka, right? Like the entire country is quite aware of the fact that there was oppression and violence, and anywhere, right? Like the Jews were quite aware of the Holocaust and the violence perpetrated against them. But there is something that is important that happens when we're having TRCs, in that it's for a particular purpose. The retelling of the narrative is for a particular purpose. First, it's done so in a very systemic way, and by the victims and by the survivors and by the perpetrators in a way that's powerful and convicting, not only to those in the nation, but also those in the international community, that really galvanizes people to action in a way that we haven't been able to see outside of the context of TRCs. Also, one of the things that TRCs does is it creates an irrefutable narrative concerning what transpired. And when you have that irrefutable narrative that has been documented, then it makes sense. It supports the execution of subsequent initiatives, right? Subsequent mechanisms, like prosecutions, for example, like vetting, for example. So if it's just this concept of there have been perpetrators and there have been harm and human rights abuses, and then there is, okay, well, let's now participate in vetting, and okay, let's now participate in prosecutions, and it seems abstract, there is a possibility that it can actually beget more violence, because then there is this perception of abstract justice, right? Which is in fact injustice. So when you have that TRC as a precursor to the other mechanisms, it creates room for a more peaceful transition to executing transitional justice, because it's irrefutable. We were all there. We all heard it, and this is what we've all agreed to being the narrative, and therefore it now makes sense, and it is therefore valid, and it is therefore just for us to persecute these particular perpetrators. It's therefore valid and just for us to go after these particular institutions and these particular bad actors within those institutions. So it's quite important and necessary in that regard. And then also it again galvanizes and makes the international community more aware of the extent of the harm and the bad actors of the harm. And I think when we talk about international communities, we're talking about a two-pronged international community. We're talking about heads of state and powerful players, but we're also talking about ordinary and average citizen who can also apply pressure on their heads of state in order to support transitional justice. So all of those elements of TJ are at work, and it's quite nuanced. But I think that if we understand that approach, if we take that approach, then it is a much more beneficial and effective way to attempt to execute transitional justice. I hope that answered your question. Please let me know. If not, then I'll feel free to add on to that.
Thank you, Natalie. Our next question is, the atrocities you're describing are still taking place. Is Ponzi involved in documenting crimes as they occur, in addition to past crimes? And are there other organizations that are doing this work? I can perhaps speak a little bit to some of the work that we do in terms of documenting intake at the hospital, Natalie, and then maybe can turn it over to you for the second part of the question. Would that work for you?
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yes. I mean, inherent in one of the things that PANSI does is that we are collecting information that we can certainly turn to other organizations that who monitor these things on a more international level, of course, while protecting the identities and the privacies of our survivors. So, for example, one of the questions that is on the medical intake form at our hospital is, did your assault take place in the presence of an armed weapon? And these are things that we use to determine, or if multiple people assaulted you, et cetera, which we use to determine whether or not this was sort of classified as a rape in conflict, sexual violence in conflict, or if it was a civilian-based atrocity. I think that many people, if you watch the film or if you have been following what has been happening in the DRC, are familiar with the resurgence of violence that is happening in the eastern region, and in particular, North Kivu, Ituri regions, which are north of where Panzi Hospital is. Panzi's in a region or a province called South Kivu. And there's been recent militia activities by a militia called the M23 in the North Kivu region directly above us. And this is almost a complete reenactment of what happened about 10 years ago, 2014. And these crimes are continuing to happen. These militias are continuing to work. And even though we're not necessarily seeing survivors from that conflict, because we are in the province that is south of that, as we continue to see upticks in violence, we know that we're always a barometer. The violence that we see at Panzi is a barometer for what happens in other regions of the DRC. So that evidence that we collect, whether it is from sexual violence and conflict, whether it is that information that we are collecting of crimes that are happening in response to some of the advocacy work that we do with civil society organizations, we do partner with other organizations who document that and sometimes put that into larger reports or recommendations that are made. And that includes Human Rights Watch. Amnesty International just recently did a quite good report with recommendations based on the M23 violence and the increasing cases of sexual violence in particular. And there are other sort of citizens organizations and NGOs who are documenting some of the crimes that are happening right now that we consider to be quite close collaborating partners. So Natalie, I don't know if you have anything else that you'd like to add to that.
No, nothing else to add to that.
Great. Thank you. I think one of the things that I apologize that we don't have my colleague Namwezi on the line at the moment, but that I would want to sort of explain what her role had been while we continue to troubleshoot her technical difficulties, is that there's a really direct link between sexual violence and resources, the natural resources that exist in DRC. About $70 trillion dollars worth of conflict minerals, as they called, reside in DRC soils, and it's almost a one-way flow of these minerals outside of the country. And none of that money goes back into the pockets of the Congolese civil society or Congolese citizens, or the betterment of their infrastructure, their public systems, etc. And this was something that Lauren mentioned in the beginning of the panel when she did the technology acknowledgement, that these are minerals that we use in the United States and in the Western world for everything from our cell phones, computers, electric cars, televisions, you name it. And we all essentially have a little piece of Congo in our homes and in our cars. And one of the reasons why this is so particularly such a problem is that at Panzi, 30% of our survivors come from mining areas. And that is because, in part, mines are hotbeds of sexual and gender-based violence. We know this, but also because there are so many militias that are battling for control of these resources and using sexual violence as a weapon to exert influence, to cause terror, to cause mass displacement, to destroy the social fabric of society, etc. And we know that there will not be sort of advancement of security, that there will not be advancement towards peace until there is some sort of mechanism, international outcry against how these minerals are being used, not only for our benefit, but to the detriment of the Congolese women and children in particular, who are the worst, the victims of this intense cycle of violence. So there's a lot of work that Ponzi is trying to do to break those systems of violence, to invert the supply chain, to put some more power back into artisanal mines to women into the supply chain, but then also drawing attention to that link between sexual violence and mines. There's a lot of attention that is played or that is paid in corporate worlds to the link between general human rights abuses and mining, whether it's forced labor or child labor, things like that. But the link between sexual violence and the natural resources that are used to make these electronics is not nearly discussed as much as it should be. And we would really like to make that part of the discourse and part of what we're trying to generate in terms of outrage for civil society and for Congo.
Yeah. I would say even too, that is sort of the central aspect of the outcry that we want to utilize from a transitional justice aspect of, what is the narrative that we want to create as we're having these conversations. As I think someone asked earlier, how to partner with Pansy and how we create a network of organizations and we create a network of partners who have organizations or who are connected in one way or another, whether it's through media, et cetera. And when we're thinking about, okay, well, if our objective is to get people's attention, and if our objective is to host TRCs or whatever it may be, in order to generate public outcry to such an extent that people are supportive of transitional justice in the DRC, and therefore it occurs in the DRC, what's the narrative, right? Like, what's the narrative that we're going to that matters and that drives the point home? I definitely think it's that intersectionality of the survivors of sexual violence and that intersectionality of that and the conflict minerals, because that's something that permeates, I think, the whole world in terms of where our natural resources end up, particularly if we're talking about the United States and we're talking about Europe. What narrative do we use to ensure that the average citizen understands what's happening in the DRC, how it directly affects them or is directly connected to them, what is happening in the DRC, how what is happening in the DRC matters, right? In a global perspective, on a global scale. So having that conversation about, and unfortunately Nwezi not here, but having that conversation about how our survivors of sexual violence and also the intersectionality of the minerals conflict and the militia groups and M23, as Emily mentioned earlier, how that's all interconnected, and why it matters so much that that transitional justice take place in the DRC is really at the crux of that.
To that point, we do have, I think you've kind of already touched on this a little bit, Natalie, but just in case you had anything further specific you wanted to mention, we have a question of what is the role of the U.S. in support of transitional justice in the DRC? As many, if not all of us, are based in the United States, are there ways we can advocate for the U.S. to be more engaged in supporting justice and accountability in the DRC?
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I think it's multifaceted. Really, I wouldn't say that there is one particular way in which we can apply pressure in the United States. But one of the fascinating things that we sort of had conversations with as an organization is the effective role of lobbying the United States government for the purposes of applying pressure to support transitional justice in the DRC. So when we've looked at how the United States has intervened in transitional justice in other African nations in the past. We've seen that it's systemically been as a result of political pressure that's been applied. And that political pressure has come from various resources. At times, they've come from the diaspora communities of those nations, sort of applying pressure and writing their senators and their elected officials and sort of drumming up support in that way. It's looked like a partnership between those diaspora communities as well as the media, sort of sounding the alarm on that. And then also it has been internal political pressure in terms of politicians within themselves applying pressure in the United States, particularly the United States president. And so we've seen that oftentimes, irrespective of where the pressure begins, whether it's legislative or mayoral or whatever it may be, or whether it's state legislature or the United States legislature, ultimately it has to lead back to the president of the United States and the State Department. And so when we are thinking about that, that third element of things, it's those sort of intergovernmental friction. So what we've seen is, where there's a Democratic sitting president or where it's an election year, the opposing party applies pressure on the sitting president's party or in the sitting president to take notice of some of these transitional justice needs in these developing nations. And so has been as a result of political pressure being applied on the sitting president. So when we think about sort of all of those examples that we've seen be successful, then as an organization, we're having conversations about, okay, well, there certainly needs to be an element of this where we're partnering up and building coalition with organizations around the country where we are developing a strategy on what an effective lobbying strategy would look like for this purpose. We're also looking at beginning to reach out to a lot of our diaspora communities in some of our larger cities, metropolises in the United States. So we're looking at Los Angeles, the Dallas area, the DMV area, as well as in Atlanta, and seeing what sort of support we can get with respect to civil societies and putting on events and creating also connections with universities and institutions that really, when we're able to solidify our network of support that we have, through whichever organizations, then we utilize that in order to then execute sort of some of these large scale opportunities, such as a lobbying day, such as the Bari proposal that we mentioned earlier to have an international conference in the DRC based out of here in the United States. And we're hoping that a conjunction of all of these strategies, including media and social media, will lend itself to drumming up sufficient information and outcry in the United States to apply pressure for transitional justice in the DRC. So I hope that made sense.
Yes. We have a question regarding going back to conflict minerals, and in particular, the world financial system. What about the world financial system, which allows the powerful to accumulate wealth in anonymous bank accounts in tax haven countries? And I maybe would just start off really quickly by saying, I don't know if Ponzi, if we can specifically speak, and Natalie, correct me if I'm wrong, to the issue of the tax haven countries per se, but what I can definitely say is part of this is the widespread corruption and of the financial systems, in particular in the DRC, which protects or allows the exploitation of certain contracts, certain relationships, so that whether it's a contract between various actors that does not actually benefit the Congolese people, contracts with these large mining conglomerates that does not end up benefiting the people or even the country as a whole, but instead ends up benefiting the pockets of individuals who are involved in the execution of these contracts. And as we look towards transitional justice and some of the things that we're hoping to do, of course, we're focused on transitional justice. These are mass atrocities, but we do hope that the progress that we would make in reforming the judicial system would extend further and then potentially extend to some of these other financial crimes and crimes regarding transparency, et cetera, that might, at least at the national level, assist with that. And I know that there's a lot of work that other organizations, such as the Century, are doing on increasing visibility when it comes to financial crimes and international financial crimes in particular. That is much more their area of expertise than Ponzi's is specifically. Natalie, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that point?
Yeah, I think I'd be remiss to talk about transitional justice in the DRC and DRC politics, I think, as exclusive from a little bit of the history of the nation, right? So I think it's important for us to place it all in context, because when we place it in the context, then we can appreciate the work at hand, and how sort of just, again, nuanced all of this is, and how our strategy isn't focused solely on one aspect of things, but on a whole host of strategies that we can implement. So from our DRC team all the way to our US team, we've been having conversations of, non-prosecutorial mechanisms such as memorializations and all of these things. Why is that? It's because, as Emily just mentioned right now, which I think is really important, is we talk about benefiting certain contracts for minerals as opposed to others. And at the core of a lot of the harm that we see happening in the DRC is because we see a government that is incapable of doing many things. It's a government that is incapable of protecting its citizens through its military. We see and part of that is because of the history of the military being ineffective due to M23 militias and other rebel groups having to forge their way into the DRC military as a result of negotiations and reconciliations, or attempted reconciliations, between rebel groups and the DRC in order to sort of appease some of the violence, as opposed to having a sufficient enough military in order to combat the rebel groups. We see also that it's a government that is incapable of addressing a lot of the widespread corruption of the country, including a lot of who gets access to these mines, who gets access to some of these contracts. We also see that it's a government that is incapable, or has been incapable, of not the rebel groups, M23 being one of the most rampant and well-known, but we have a lot of different rebel groups that are fighting each other for access to these mines, as Emily mentioned earlier, and they're widespread. And some of them are Congolese, and it's not, it's not just an M23 militia that is backed by foreign governments as well. And so when we look to basically 1960, and we see the exit of the Belgian government after the independence of the Congo, one of the things that we have to appreciate is that, in the 1400s and 1500s, when the DRC first comes into contact with what's not Spain, Portugal, Portuguese colonials, what we see is that that's around the 1400, and from that on, it's sort of an immediate contact of Europe and the DRC, and then there's the slave trade, and there's the rubber, and then there is the colonizing, effectively, of Leopold of the DRC. And when that occurred, what society looked like in the DRC were traders, right? There were barters and there were traders, and it was a society that looked incredibly different from the society that was in reality by the time of independence. And the way that colonialism worked, pertaining the Belgians with the DRC, was very paternalistic, right? And so Belgians didn't create opportunities for the Congolese to become educated until much later on. And even still, there were no opportunities that were given to the Congolese people to be able to infiltrate a lot of the systems that were being built, a lot of, especially the administrative roles, or any really substantive roles in the DRC. And so by the time independence happens, we have generations upon generations of Congolese where at oppression of society looked one way, and at the exit of Belgian colonialism, society looked completely different. There was no longer a bartering system. There was an entirely new world that was built. And then on top of that, at that juncture, there is the United States and Europe sort of infiltrating the politics of this nation that's attempting to develop itself as, with its own right. And so then there is the placement of Mobutu and all of these things. And so the point that I think is necessary is to say that the DRC has never really functioned as a healthy nation, has never really functioned as a nation that had the capacity really to self-govern, to have a military that was functioning, to have systems and societies that worked well and that were able to be managed effectively. And so we see all of this as an adverse effect, our inability to sort of address the issues that are happening in the DRC for all of these years. We see that very much intrinsic in its development. And so when we think about all of that and we're thinking, okay, we're appeasing or we're attempting to appeal to the United States to intervene with transitional justice, or with Europe to intervene in transitional justice, what then do we need as a nation? What then makes most sense for what's the substantive material help that the DRC needs? And I think that it goes very much into vetting. It goes very much into the judiciary. It goes very much into the military, right? So if these systems, if these institutions are not reformed, it's very difficult to see a situation, a reality in which there is non-recurrence and there is lasting peace in the DRC. So I think that it's important for us to sort of draw that image and to draw that picture so that we can have a right understanding of what all we're after in terms of what is necessary for the DRC to thrive as an independent nation.
Thank you, Natalie. And I think that we have one or two other questions, but I don't think that we will unfortunately have time to get to them. But what I will do is make sure to take note of them and perhaps can follow up individually, especially with those who have some follow-up questions to some of the things that we discussed. But I do want to turn it back over to Lauren if there's anything that she would like to conclude with, but did want to thank everybody from our end and from Panzi for joining, for watching the documentary. One of the very last questions that we had received is, what can we do to be better advocates for ethical sourcing and better advocates in general? And I think that one of the things that I know is very frustrating. And I say this as the white person from the office in DC, so I cannot even imagine what it must be like for my Congolese colleagues, but is this lack of attention and this lack of indignation about what the injustice that they continue to face. And one of the things that we often say is, of course, we are standing by and we are outraged as well by all of the other conflicts around the world where sexual violence is used as a weapon of war, including Ukraine. But at the same time, one of the things that we also say is that if there was a global outcry, if there was a global mobilization of resources and aid and political pressure that was similarly mobilized to Congo, as we're currently seeing with Ukraine, we might not still be in this cycle of violence 25 plus years later. And in particular, if you, as Natalie's last answer, going all the way back into to colonization, this is a really systemic problem. And I think that the lack of global outrage that it has faced is something that we find particularly frustrating. So it's really encouraging when we have these meetings, when we are asked these questions, when there are people who are so engaged with the topic and are looking to learn more, because it does show that there is hope. So I would say have those difficult conversations, continue to bring it up, read, There are some excellent resources and books that we can share with you, books that our founder, Dr. Mukwege, wrote, books that survivors have written, books about the mineral sourcing, trade, etc. And maybe we can also circulate some of those with Lauren afterwards to share if you're interested. And then stay in touch with us, stay in touch with the Never Again Coalition, because a lot of these ideas, we are in the early stages, we're looking for funding. We are starting to have those conversations with diaspora groups, as Natalie said, but in our next phases of those ideas, we are going to rely on those global citizens and those people like yourself who have been sufficiently outraged and do want to act in order to help us effectively advance some of the strategies that we are starting to put into place. So I'll end there, turn it to Lauren. Thank you, Natalie. So sorry that Namwezi was unable to join us, but thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you all for having us. Now, just quickly add, talk about it with your friends, share about it at the dinner table, and write to your congressman, and just make a lot of noise.
Thank you. Thank you both, Natalie and Emily. It's just such a pleasure to have you both here. And I think, Emily, you brought up hope. And I think that that's something that Ponzi really gives, both to this issue and to transitional justice, to it globally, really, because it's an inspiration what is possible anywhere in the world. And it just needs more attention. So just deeply appreciative of the work that both you are doing and that Ponzi Foundation is doing. I put some links in the chat, but we will be sending out an email following this to anyone that registered with a recording of this, but also with some of those resources that Emily mentioned. So we'll make sure to include those, but please reach out to us if you have any further questions. And I encourage people to sign up for newsletters from Ponzi, because it's always great to hear about the incredible work that they're doing. I want to also just thank all of our partners in this series. In our panel last week was recorded also. So for anyone that registered, you'll be receiving in the next week or so an email with resources from both of those. So just very appreciative, and everyone have a very good rest of your day. Thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.